it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Todd Deatherage. There's information with his biography, and he has a very interesting career path, which you'll read about. And I thought I would personalize this introduction by saying that Todd and I met only 8 months ago through a mutual friend. My wife and I were going on a religious pilgrimage with a group of about 40 people, and we'd never been to the Middle East before, and we thought we might not be going back to the Middle East. By the way, Israel strikes me as being sort of a dicey place. You know, it seemed like a dangerous place, and everybody who was gone had convinced us that it wasn't. And we decided to extend our trip by a few days, and I just fanned out to my friends who had already been to Israel and asked for their advice if we were to stay a few extra days, what would we do? And one of them introduced me to Todd, and by email, and then the very next day he said, coincidentally, I'm going to be in Chicago. If you and your wife are interested, why don't we get together for a cup of coffee or dinner? So that's what we did. We spent a few hours together and sort of got a sense for what our interests are and meshed that with what the Telos group does. So what they do, and we will give you some detail about this, is to organize trips the past decade or more now for mostly Americans, but not exclusively, to travel to the Middle East and get a bird's eye view of what I'll call the peace process is really about. What we read in the headlines, what we understand as Americans, is very filtered. And the opportunity to meet Christians and Jews and Muslims in their community and to get their perspective on what's going on from the ground level was profound. And the 14-point itinerary that they put together for us over the 4 days that we were there was a life-changing experience for me. And I thought that if Todd was willing to come back to Chicago and share some of the insights with what he and his group do, that you might be inspired as well. So Todd.
Thanks, David. It's so good to be with you. It's always an honor to be invited to speak at a Rotary Club, but it's an incredible honor to be invited to Rotary number 1. Nearly 20 years ago, a guy named Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. I think you read that. His point was that one of the challenges in contemporary American life is that fewer and fewer people are a part of a community, or a part of the sort of civic and religious groupings and communities that are really important in sustaining democracy. Or in another way, he talked about how important groups like Rotary are to our social fabric and to our health as a nation. And so when I see the impact of Rotary clubs, not just here in America, but around the world, I'm really honored to be here at the place where it all started. It's a reminder that a few people with a vision acting together as a community to serve others in the common good can bring transformative change, not just to their own community, but to the world. And that's really what I want to talk a little bit about today, about the work of communities of peacemakers who open up the possibility of bringing change and transformation to places that need it desperately, and about the things we can learn from those doing this honest and gritty work of peacemaking. So I'm going to begin by telling you the story of 2 friends of mine. The woman on your right is Robbie Damon. She's a Jewish-Israeli mother who lives in Tel Aviv. Her son David was killed by a Palestinian sniper as he served on Israeli military duty in the West Bank. The guy on the left is Bassam Arami, a Muslim Palestinian father who now lives in Jericho. Bassam was a peace activist, actually, whose 10-year-old daughter, Abir, was killed by an Israeli border policeman as she stood outside her school in Jerusalem one morning. These people should not be friends, and yet they chose, rather than to seek revenge, they chose to seek reconciliation with people on the other side, and to become agents of reconciliation. And they are joined by about 600 Israeli and Palestinian families that are part of an organization called the Parent Circle. So these are people who've lost someone they love, an immediate family member in the conflict, and they've chosen a path of reconciliation. They are what we call radical peacemakers, ordinary people who through the crucible of unimaginable pain and grief have become extraordinary people. At Telos, the organization that I co-founded, we believe one of the greatest needs in our divided age is communities of people living as peacemakers, radically principled leaders committed to the common good and to a set of postures and practices that help us find ways to either resolve our differences when we can or honor each other's dignity when we can't. Our mission is to form communities of American peacemakers to help bring healing to intractable conflict at home and abroad. And we do it in an unusual place. Our laboratory is one of the world's longest running conflicts. You don't really do peacemaking in Tahiti, right? You have to go to war-torn places, to places riven by conflict. And that's the place we do it. It's a place that many Americans care about, and in some ways, it's a vexing foreign policy challenge to the United States that functions like a domestic political issue. And so we've sort of imported this conflict into our culture, into our politics, and in many ways to be pro-Israel in America is to be anti-Palestinian, or to be pro-Palestinian is to be anti-Israeli. And our work is to try to change that. We're trying to build a third way movement. We call it pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace. Did I lose anybody yet? Because that's either kind of a ridiculous idea or it's something really kind of edgy. And we think that we're doing something that is contributing to a different way of engaging something that seems intractable but might not be if we thought about it differently. The word telos is a Greek word which means your big purpose, your aim, the thing you're aiming for. Our telos in this situation is security and dignity and freedom for all Israelis and all Palestinians. It's rooted in the idea of mutual flourishing for both people. We believe there's no good future for one people in the land without a good future for everyone in the land. And so for 10 years, we've been leading this sort of unique trip to the Holy Land, a unique pilgrimage, if you will, to immerse Americans in the stories and the experiences of people on both sides. And I'll just run through some photos that give you just a sampling of the kinds of experiences we have. Sharing Shabbat meals with Jewish families on Friday night, visiting Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial, meeting with Jewish political leaders, with settlers living in the West Bank, with security experts and human rights activists, sitting down with Islamic leaders, with Palestinian Christians, refugees, Arab business leaders, young people. It's quite an amazing set of experiences meant to confuse as much as bring clarity, at least in the beginning, to remind us how complicated these things can be. But once we've gone through the complexity, we hopefully can begin to see more clearly and more wisely. And so we also introduce our travelers to those doing the work of coexistence and peace and reconciliation and justice. People like Robbie and Bassam, who I just introduced you to. And just as an aside, when we started Telos 10 years ago, we really didn't use the words peace and peacemaking very much because they can sound so unserious in the way that we often think about them. I'm from Washington, D.C., where we always like to sound like we're very serious people. And people who talk about peace are the same folks who drive Priuses and like rainbows and unicorns and bad poetry. No offense if any of you are doing those things. But of course, peace is a very serious thing. It's a state in which men and women live together in equitable relationship with each other in societies of flourishing and peace and justice. And peacemaking is very gritty and serious when you see it being done. Think of my friends who lost children in the conflict and are now working together to help each side see the humanity of the other. That's very difficult work. And it's from these people that we learn about how to better engage the world around us as peacemakers. And so the alumni of our trips come back with a new set of glasses with which to see the world. And they begin to dig into some of our own challenges here at home. I mean, our hope is that people go on these trips and they come back and they begin to reshape the way Americans engage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, tell different kinds of stories, demand different kinds of actions, policies, give differently in terms of resources and that sort of thing. But they also come back and they start to apply these same things that they're learning to things that we have, challenges we have here at home. And so a lot of folks get involved in trying to get to know their interfaith neighbors, or issues like race relations. In fact, we just launched a Telos trip experience in the U.S. South that it's aimed at better telling an honest American story. What is our own story? How did we get to this problem we have today with race, and how does it still plague us, and what are the issues that we still need to address and deal with? What is our more honest American story? So I'm going to just spend the time today giving you 5 things that we learned from peacemakers. There's a lot more than this, but I've kind of picked out 5 of some of the most important things that we learned from peacemakers in Israel and Palestine that help us even engage with them better and help us engage here at home better. The first is a very simple one, just listening to understand. It's a special kind of listening. Listening is actually a skill we have to practice. Some of us have to practice it more than others. You can ask my wife. So often when someone is saying something we disagree with, we're mostly just listening to them long enough so that we can formulate an argument about why they're so wrong. And sometimes we don't even let them finish before we jump in and tell them why they're wrong. And of course, that's not really listening. Real listening humanizes someone that you disagree with. It offers them respect. It makes them feel heard. And it also can change what you think, or shape it, or maybe just strengthen what you already believe to be true in a deeper way. There's a time for arguing and debating, but usually before all that, there's a time for honest listening, to understand. And peacemakers show us not just how to do that, but why it's so important, and what potential it holds for bringing understanding or just finding ways to live together in spite of deep differences. A second thing we learned from peacemakers is how to hold more than one truth in tension. It's a great quote from a physicist named Niels Bohr that I love. The opposite of fact is obviously a falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may well be another profound truth. So since I've already taken on to Palestine and probably offended somebody in the room, I'll go a step further. We might need border security and compassion and respect for human dignity for those trying to cross it. Maybe those are 2 truths that we would somehow try to hold in tension. My own story can kind of help prove the point. My English ancestors emigrated to Virginia in the early 1700s, and that has obviously shaped my American experience and how I tell the American story. Of course, when they arrived in Virginia, there were Native Americans already living here, and there were Africans who came to Virginia when my colonizing ancestors did, under very different, very brutal, very dehumanizing circumstances. Their descendants have an equally valid American story that can sound very different from mine. And our stories aren't necessarily in competition, and nor are they in competition with another different story of America told by a more recent immigrant. The opposite of one truth may be another profound truth, and the combination of these different truths can lead us to a better understanding of the whole story. Peacemakers know that we can hold different truths in tension and not become relativists. They also know that sometimes we have to find ways to honor and retell stories we haven't heard before or that aren't widely told. That's a bit what we're doing in our American pilgrimage in the South. But when we go to Israel and Palestine, one of the things that we do in the beginning of the trip is we ground you in the experiences that both people have had. They have a shared history, and yet very different experiences of that same history. And so it's important that you understand their own story and how they got there, because we can't be trapped in the past, but any kind of peacemaking that's uninformed by the past is really the stuff of rainbows and unicorns. That's the unserious kind of peacemaking. You have to be informed by the things that have happened and how we got here to know how to build a different kind of future that somehow takes those things into account. A third thing we learned from peacemakers is the link between peace and justice. Peacemakers teach us there's a direct link here. When people feel trapped in injustice and like no one is listening, they often make noise. And they disrupt the peace, they protest, they riot, and even engage in acts of violence. People in power who don't experience injustice as a regular part of their daily lives often want quiet, but they fail to see the need for justice. But Martin Luther King taught us that true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Peacemakers continually remind us to look for those linkages
and the presence of tension is often a barometer of injustice. The next thing I think that's important to think about when we think about peacemaking and peacemakers, they teach us how to disrupt entrenched cycles of conflict by acting differently. Unresolved conflicts that carry on over time can become even more difficult to solve because they begin to generate a self-perpetuating nature. A conflict occurs, one side seeks revenge, the other side responds in kind, a cycle is created. As are the accompanying dehumanizing stereotypes and stories that we begin to tell. And in the most difficult scenarios, the cycle is perpetuated not just by animosity that calcifies into hatred, but also by violence. Cycles of violence and the belief in the necessity of revenge or vengeful action fueled by hatred and fear and dehumanization of enemies mark some of the most intractable conflicts in the world today. Sometimes the work of peacemaking is as simple as someone stepping out of the circle, acting in a different way. And so here are a few examples. This is a friend of mine named Todd. He's a Palestinian Christian farmer from Bethlehem. He lives on a 100-acre property that his grandfather purchased during the